Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I'm very proud to welcome you to this edition of our 2022-2023 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series. The lecture series has been supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA Brain Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Data Science, and through a grant from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. Since 2016, the Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series has focused on the use of data science methodologies, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and statistical modeling as they pertain to different themes in the biomedical and health sciences. This year's theme has been data science and the public health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, where each Friday we've enjoyed presentations from leading thinkers about the issues, the promise, the opportunities, and the hurdles which are associated with understanding the secondary health effects of the COVID-19 virus. These include, but are not limited to, delayed health checkups and treatments, mental health concerns, drug abuse, increased obesity, and the long lingering health effects associated with the SARS-CoV-19 virus. Participants selected for our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program will be leveraging these presentations as vital material for our culminating in-person grant project development workshop to be held at the Lodge at St. Edward's Park in beautiful Seattle, Washington in June of 2023. Today, I am delighted to welcome our final speaker of our series, Dr. Vivian Bonazzi, Chief Biomedical Data Scientist and Managing Director at Deloitte. Dr. Bonazzi received a Bachelor of Science in Medical Laboratory Science from the University of Canberra in Australia, an M.Sc in Pharmacology from the University of Melbourne, and a Ph.D. in Molecular Pharmacology and Computational Biology from the University of Melbourne. She is a highly experienced biomedical data scientist who's always had a passion for understanding how data science methods and technologies can be applied to biomedical data to yield a better understanding of biology. Her work is focused on more easily being able to share, access, analyze, find, and provide attribution to biomedical data and tools, regardless of geographic location, size, or complexity, so as to enable new biomedical discoveries. She is a thought leader concerning the development of a data commons, a cloud-based platform supporting the ability to easily utilize the FAIR principles for biomedical data and tools. Importantly, as a 2023 BDSIL mentor, she recognizes, champions, and advocates for team science approaches for major biomedical research endeavors. And this is work that she carries on today, working at Deloitte. So in bringing to a close our 2022-2023 Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series this spring, today's lecture is entitled Towards a Data Commons for Biomedicine, where the amount of biomedical data continues to grow at ever faster rates. And Vivian will describe for us some of the community experience the team science approaches needed for developing a data commons. That is this interoperable infrastructure which co-locates data storage and compute with common analytic tools. And she will present several case studies and underscore the importance of team science in doing data science. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us and for having joined us throughout the year. Also, our specially selected 2022-2023 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants and alumni are strongly encouraged to submit any questions they have via the chat feature in the Zoom sessions. I will synthesize these questions and ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of the lecture. And with that, welcome, Vivian. We are absolutely so pleased that you're able to join us and share with us some of your thoughts and your work and ideas.
Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to today. So today, what I'd like to do is follow on after that wonderful introduction there by Jack. But first, I'd like to just give a little bit of an understanding about what I do and Deloitte. And I hope that also touches on the aspect that I think Jack's been really talking about, which is team science. So as Jack had stated before, I'm the Chief Biomedical Data Scientist and also a Managing Director at Deloitte. I co-lead the Biomedical Data Science group within Deloitte, it's known as BDS. And what we have in my team is a diverse set of matrix skills for the various projects that we do. And I've listed some of those out here. I have quite a few folks in my team that are PhD, MS biomedical scientists of some sort. Almost everyone in my team, they come from a biomedical background, but they understand about data or metadata. They don't necessarily code, but they can. But clearly they understand the constructs of those data and also the meaning of that data. We also have data scientists that can also be some of our PhD scientists, but we also have data scientists that don't necessarily have that background. And I just listed a couple of things that we use on a regular basis here. But the rest of the team is also made up of important different skills. So cloud engineers, we have cybersecurity experts, we do UI, UX design. We also do, importantly, project management. Really complicated, large projects require very capable skills in putting things together. These are not simple timelines. These are really complex management plans to ensure that we can actually meet the deadlines that we have proposed and work closely with our clients. But we also have to be able to communicate both with our clients and other people that are not necessarily in our field. So we work with marketing folks within Deloitte, but we also have science writers within our team. And then because we're dealing with large contracts, mostly with the government, which I'll speak about in a minute, we have to work with legal conflicts of interest. Deloitte is large, so we have to ensure, and we do a lot of auditing, so we have to ensure there's no conflicts of interest. We deal with contracts, financials, and pricings. Each one of the people that represents that skill in my team is matrixed in for different parts of a particular project. And we work really hard at trying to make sure that those overlaps come in at different times. And people may not be skilled in pricing if they're a scientist, but they understand what that needs to bring. And that theme is something I'm going to try and sort of thread through this. That interdisciplinary nature of the way we do science and the people is critical for success and being able to drive the future that we handle with digital ecosystems. The work I primarily do is in the government and public sector. So I work with HHS agencies. Primarily, I work with NIH and CDC, but the rest of my team and my co-lead, Jürgen Klenk, works with some of the others listed here. We also work with the VA and also military health. And I do a fair amount of work with health nonprofits. In my field, they're often disease-related or organ-related, but they're all dealing with very similar issues that the government is dealing with as well. The work I do is we provide advisory support or effort if an organization is trying to understand how to use its data or to develop data governance. We also provide analytics services for managing, storing, and primarily interconnecting an organization's scientific data. We can connect it to its enterprise data that is not related to the science. We understand the connectivity pieces in there, but we tend to primarily focus on the science. So that's what we do. And I'm trying to make this go forward. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, today we're going to talk about biomedical data as a key element in these complex and evolving digital ecosystems. I think all of you know something about biomedical data. I hope by the end of this you'll know more about it. But data in itself does not sit on its own. And I think understanding how it fits into the ecosystem is important because we often think of them as individual elements and that can create its issues. Also, depending on what you come from, if you're a pure biomedical scientist or a pure data scientist, you will see the world in a different way. So when you're looking at an ecosystem, we have to work together both technically, but we also have to work together as people to understand it. I want to point out a couple of things as I go through. It's an evolving place for looking at digital ecosystems, and they're not well connected or interoperable. I don't think that's malicious. It's just the nature of a large collection of data that you need to work on. At times, it's difficult to understand where to start. But if you do look at improving interoperability, it improves the ability to share and reuse data and to further discoveries. And I'll bring up a couple of points here, but I think the obvious one, as I think everyone knows with COVID-19, we didn't have a really good way of sharing our data to start with, and it became really apparent that we needed to do better if we were going to work together to try and solve how to treat, track it, etc. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how all of this fits together in terms of a data commons and how that can support data infrastructure interoperability, because it's really these two things, data and the systems that it sits on that have to work together in order to be able to drive discovery and better understand that data. So I'm not going to talk about this. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because almost every talk, people ask me, what programming language should I learn? It's depending what you need to do. So I'm not going to go through this. It is important, but it's a rabbit hole that I don't want to get into today. What I do think is important is these topics. They're equally as important as that. The skills of writing code are important. I certainly spent many years doing this, but it's understanding the context of what you're trying to do that's equally as important. I can find many data scientists that can code in Python or R, but not that many that understand the context of what they're writing for and why. And if you don't do that, you won't really understand what you're doing in the first place. And secondly, you just create more silos and lack of interconnectivity. So what I think is equally important to draw it here is when you're looking at ecosystems is you need to understand the holistic picture of what you're trying to do scientifically, understand the context of the analysis you're trying to do. You have to understand how to use data securely, particularly when you're looking at biomedical data, because it's often controlled access. It deals with human data. And authentication and authorization is important. Not so much the application as in the tooling here that I'm talking about. It's just you need to know who's permitted to use it and who is not, particularly when you're dealing with human data. What is the business value of data? I'm going to come to this again a little later. You may not think about this as an academic institution, but it is a business of data. Organizations are businesses. And if you don't understand why you're generating that data or how you're transforming it in some way, then you're not really understanding what its real value is going to be inside an organization, whether that be academic or commercial. I think it's really important to have a set of skills that you can communicate to non-technical members of your team, whether they be non-scientists, non-computer scientists, none of the above that are really working in the legal application of some of these. I've had many examples in working at Deloitte where I'm working with other team members that have none of the backgrounds in computer science or bio, but they really need to understand what we're trying to do to ensure that we really can deliver, and if there are any concerns about that. I think a really important one, which is close to me, but I think it's something that's important to an increasing number of people, is what are you doing to support interoperability, shareability, and reuse of your data tools and your results? If all you're doing is something in a microcosm, that may be valuable, but I think if we are able to share our information and our data, that's going to help with new discoveries. I think it's also important to understand how to use data responsibly, and that really comes from a diverse set of skills. One of the skills that I haven't listed before was an ethicist, but we are increasingly looking at that because, as I think we've seen recently with AI generating tools, the issue there becomes how are you ethically and responsibly using some of these tools for the outcomes and the impact on people's lives, particularly when you're talking about health and you're also dealing with health disparities. So I think really it's very important that when we bring teams together to solve these problems, they have those diverse skills and they listen to each other, another really important skill. And I think understanding that data is really part of a complex and evolving digital ecosystem is important. So you can bring your technology skills to this, but you need to be thinking about these things all the time. I urge my team all the time to be thinking about these kinds of things that are outside the norm of what they do on a daily basis, because I really think it ultimately provides the best way of an outcome from a project, and also the best outcome when difficulties arise within the team to be able to talk to each other and figure things out. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit now around the data itself. So what do I mean by biomedical big data? Again, I'm just going to point out some things here. Some of these may be obvious, some are not. Data comes in various forms in biomedical data. So there's imaging types of data. I've shown those here. There's genomics data, which is a really big, it's certainly been over the last 20 years, growing large number data set. But also protein folding. Protein data is very large. Spectro data is pretty huge. Electronic health records, which were usually all written on paper and now almost all electronic, and they're increasing in number of volume. And there's always wearables, which I think most of you will have come across as well. And that the volume of that data is really huge. So it's a large set of data we're talking about. So what does it really, when I say what does it make it big? Well, it's volume. There's a lot of it in terms of size. The velocity, the rate of which it's coming out is very high. And it's getting faster. The variety, which is many different data types. There are increasing number of data types and subtypes as time goes on. And veracity, which is this lovely term applying to really, what's the quality of that data? And if we don't pay attention to any of these things, then we're not going to understand how to deal with the data itself. But all of these things together are important, but what's it really pointing to? And I think the key thing here is that we're in a digital economy and that data itself has value, and that data is actually central to that digital economy. In particular here, I think I want to point out that a digital economy is characterized by using data to gain a business advantage. And as I mentioned before, I said the word business. Yes, academic institutions are a business. And I think you have to think about that for how you're thinking about what your digital economy is in whatever organization you are. And that the organizations of the future have to be born digital. If you don't, you'll really be at a disadvantage. And I think this new economy is really important to think about it as a digital economy. So I think in the future, and now I think true, organizations will be defined by their digital assets and how they will be leveraged. So in scientific organizations, a scientific digital asset, I'll use the term data throughout the rest of this talk, but I really mean any digital asset. And that could be data and metadata coming from a specific experiment that you wrote down and digitized, or it came straight off a machine. It could be analysis that you've done, that you've taken data from a machine. It could be the metadata that you've taken from that data that came from the machine or was transformed. But it also applies to artifacts like software, the analytics, the workflows, any services like APIs you have with it. That is also a digital asset. The documentation, which is really important, the SOPs, the READMEs, anything else that you have, journal articles, and increasingly in the digital world, blogs, vlogs, YouTube, etc. I think we're talking about that today. This is being streamed. I think what we're trying to get at here is that the most successful organizations of the future will be those that can really leverage their digital assets and transform those into an interconnected digital ecosystem. If you just have lots of digital assets and you can't connect them, they're just dots in the system. Really, is that transformational knowledge will come from understanding the interconnectedness of that digital ecosystem. So let's look at some of the issues around biomedical data. There are many, and it's what's stopping some of that interconnectivity, but there is some hope, and I'll bring that a little bit later in this talk. So I think in the case of, certainly in the academic world, the journal article is still often seen as the end goal. That means that the data that supports that journal article is a means to an end, and it's low value. And I think some of that is the lack of incentives around this, and that is funding agencies in general have prioritized biomedical outcomes and consider interoperability as secondary interest. So essentially, publish your paper, doesn't matter about the data, it's okay, you needed to use it for the paper, but then we're done. And that data is not fair. This is a term that is being used increasingly both in the commercial and the academic world, and that is relating to data's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. When you pay attention to this, this really allows connectivity within data. Now, I have a short, hopefully it'll show up. This is a 2-minute video. Some folks may have seen this before. I think a couple of thoughts here is, this is the issue of what happens with data when you pay attention only to the journal article. The other interesting thing about this little video is that, if it will play, is that this was done in 2012. And really the issues haven't changed that much. So I'm just going to play it now and hopefully it will run.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Dr. Judy Benign. I'm an oncologist at NYU School of Medicine.
Hello, Dr. Judy Benign.
I read your article about B-cell functions. It was very interesting. I think that I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer.
I am not an oncologist.
I know, but I think I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer.
Oh.
So do you have the data?
Everything you need to know is in the article.
No. What I need is the data. Will you share your data?
I am not sure that will be possible.
But your work is in PubMed Central and was funded by NIH.
That is true.
And it was published in Science, which requires that you share your data.
I did publish in Science.
Then I am requesting your data. Can I have a copy of your data?
Everything you need to know is in the article.
No.
I am not sure where my data is.
But surely you saved your data.
I did. I saved it on a USB drive.
Where is the USB drive?
It is in a box. It is in a box at home. I just moved.
But can I use your data?
There are many boxes. Well, I forgot to label the boxes.
All right. So I think now we see this is a problem that is consistent, and we still can see it being a problem at the moment. There's a reference here. Down the bottom here, if you have the slides, you can actually watch the entirety of this YouTube video. It's actually quite long. I just took a small slice of it. But you can see that the shareability of data is a problem when you only look at journal articles. So some additional considerations around the problems with biomedical data. Data is cheap to generate and costly to store in local servers. That has been a problem for quite a long time. Lately, what's been going on, certainly over the last several years now, it's cheaper to store on cloud. In the case of biomedicine, GCP, Google or AWS are the primary stores, but that's changing as well, but they're the primary ones at the moment. You also have issues where you get multiple copies of the same data in different locations and sometimes on the same cloud. So you can have 5 copies of the data, they're all on GCP, but they're all in separate accounts and no one is able to share the data or wants to. There's also a case of building data resources that cannot be easily found by others, and that data resources are not connected to each other and cannot share data or tools. And the focus of late has been to build on cloud platforms and tools, and really it's all about the tool, not the data. When you do this and you have these kinds of issues, it creates silos and it creates difficulty in using the data, even just for a small number of experiments. And most researchers really want to be able to share data to have new discoveries and to share it in order to find out different things from their own data or other people's data. But when the incentives are unaligned, this is what you get. So what's changing though? I think there's a number of things that are actually occurring at the moment, and they're all in the positive realm. So number one, research repositories for data are increasing where there's a requirement for when you store the data, there's some consistency in the way you store it, rather than just being stored at a PI site. The other one is the landmark paper around FAIR, which I think came out in 2016 by Wilkinson. I've just got a copy up here. This is really pushing the idea of that findable, accessible, interoperable reproducibility of data and guiding ideas and policies where it's really driving that kind of adoption is really important. Additional to that, in underlying pieces is increased use of metadata and consistency in that metadata, having unique identifiers associated with data that are not driven just by one organization, but an agreed upon set of identifiers. Open sharing and open data standards and software. I think that's also driving that. You can adopt new pieces. It forms like Lego blocks if they're all the same, and you can reshare these. NIH data sharing policies have been evolving as well. I've worked at NIH, but I've also been consuming of some of their data and support some of their projects. As of 2023, and at the bottom here is the link for the URL, NIH released the 2023 data management and sharing policies, which are substantial, and they are really moving towards fairness of data. And I think that's really driving it from a funding and a policy perspective and requiring groups to spend more time to think about those things. And then there are examples of community-driven organizations. I've given one example here, which is the Global Alliance for Global Health, Genomics and Global Health, which is GA4GH. But there are others like RDA, the Research Data Alliance, and many others that are open standards for using data and tools. And adoption of those results in a consistent use of data and also systems that actually support it. So I think there's a lot of support in this in the community, and I think there's a lot of drive to do a better job of that. And I think the FAIR principles here drive data to become the currency of an organization and make it reusable and much more easily shareable as a resource. And the policies that promote that data sharing via FAIR help change the culture inside an organization, whatever that is, to ensure that you can create connectivity of data. Okay, so let's move on. We've talked a lot about data, but there's more to it than that. And that is, we also need to think about a digital ecosystem that allows transactions to occur on FAIR data at scale. And that's pretty common in biomedicine because the data is large and diverse. We're talking petabytes and above. And you need to be able to do that. You're not going to be doing that on anything except some sort of computer. And the concept of a data commons, which has come from a number of people, is really about looking at digital assets and infrastructures, including software and all the other pieces that support use of data, and making them fair. So can you reuse APIs that have a consistent form? Is your data in a form that's consistent with some sort of data standard? That's what we're getting at. When you do those transactions at scale with data and digital assets and infrastructures that are fair, that allows to look at interoperability. So a data commons facilitates data and infrastructure interoperability. And a data commons can be a cloud platform, but often isn't. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, before we go there, what do I mean by a data commons? This is just really a principle here. It's really in three parts. There's some form of compute. It's usually cloud, but not always. You can have on-prem, and there are also hybrids. There's a data layer of some sort. And then there's a collection of tools and services, and they range in a couple of different types. At the lowest layer, there are services that basically interconnect with the data in some way, move it around. They're not related to any of the science, but they prepare the data in some way to be able to make it used. It's also important to have an authentication layer there in order to be able, particularly if it's protected data. In the case of you're dealing with NIH data, dbGaP is one of those controlled access data. You want to ensure that that data is truly secure and allowing access to only people that are authorized to use it. But you also need services to index data, be able to run containers and workflows. And then you have over the top of that tools that actually do the analysis in a scientific form. And not everyone in the biomedical world is able to code. And so what we need is user interfaces and portals that allow scientists without that kind of background to be able to interact with the data in a useful, meaningful way, and they can do experiments. So really the layer of a commons is in three parts. The compute platform, which is usually cloud, data, and some form of software services and tools that interact with the data. But as I mentioned before, what you want those tools and data to be is to be fair, to apply and to comply the best possible standards that are available at the moment. So when you're comparing two things, whether software or data, these things are interoperable. And so I've got a little icon here down in the corner. It's really a little platform, if you want to use it, that uses FAIR principles. And I'm going to use that diagram again. So moving on, let's talk about some of the challenges that we have with data commonses. I think we have a number of these. And if I can get my slide to go. All right. So the last 5 years, we've seen a huge explosion of academic and commercial cloud platforms, and quite a number of them claim to be data commonses, but there are differences. That difference is merging, which is good, but there are differences. So a cloud platform looks like a data commons, and it's basically cloud plus data plus tools. But a data commons is really trying to apply that fairness, which is what are you doing with consistency of using data standards or best practices to your data and your software in that system, so that when you're going to work with another system, it's using the same principles. The problem we have is that cloud platforms look like a commons, but they're not. They tend to be mostly driven as an internal source. So let me describe a little more what I mean by this. Cloud platforms really are built with a premise of simplifying data and often a slick UI. They're optimized essentially for a very specific purpose and often a very specific data type, or data types, a small number of data. The reason for that is they're trying to look at a series of use cases for some sort of scientific use case, and they have 2, 3, 5 maybe data sets which they bring in-house. So they store the data on cloud specifically for this particular thing. The data and tools are fair enough within the confines of the specific cloud platform. What happens inside those is these cloud platforms often have project-based data schemas. They're not necessarily compliant with the current standards, and they're not necessarily utilizing any fair terms or any other assets, whether it be software or data, within the platform. And what happens over time with these platforms too is the data schemas are then conformed entirely for the platform, and they evolve away. If they started from a standard, they evolve away from it simply because they have an internal focus to drive to an outcome. It is also true that some of these standards are not available at the time, so they have to create something. But what happens is you get an insularity in terms of the data schema specific for that cloud platform. And that causes problems if you're trying to get one cloud platform to talk to another one. They also prioritize internal capabilities over external connections that support interoperability. By that, I mean, they prioritize the kind of software they do to drive to what their outcome is. So in this case, and I point this out here in the incentives, often these cloud platforms are driven to some sort of biomedical outcome by the definition of some use cases they have. When you do that, you build all of the software, and all of the data that comes to that is aligned with whatever that outcome is. It is not aligned with being necessarily interoperable. That is not the first thing that is thought about here. And as time goes on, that becomes more and more complex, and it becomes more and more insular to the actual cloud platform itself. This is what I mean by prioritizing internal capabilities rather than trying to externalize via interoperability. The incentives are not aligned either. It is not to, and the incentives are not to interconnect with other cloud platforms. The funding agencies really prioritize biomedical outcomes, and they really often have considered interoperability a second interest. If you spend a lot of time doing interoperability and you don't look at the outcome, and you have a funding stream from NIH and they're looking for an outcome, this causes a clash. So people will naturally just build a system that will go for that outcome. The commercial clouds are really not that different in this context, and that is the commercial cloud platforms must maintain market share and drive sales to their platforms. So the more users they have that are willing to pay for their platform, they're going to keep modifying that. So it's really easy for the user to keep coming back and using whatever their platform is. There is no incentive here for commercial platforms to interconnect with others because they would simply lose market share. And this has just created a great deal of essentially vendor lock-in, whether you be academic or commercial, and they become essentially silos. But there are some issues here, to be fair to the cloud platforms, that I think points to this issue that ecosystems really are evolving. And that is, FAIR is, as a term and application, is extremely complex and very time-consuming to achieve effectively. I don't think we haven't achieved an optimal yet. I think we're still trying to work it through because we understand that the shareability of data and the reuse of it is important for cost and also for achieving discoveries. FAIR itself is an evolving landscape. For example, there's an increasing number of data and tool standards and best practices. They're changing, they're being upgraded, updated every day, and new ones are coming out as we have new types of data. New types of standards around software are coming out as well. Before it was just a tool, now there's consistency around the workflows, because often when you're doing biomedical studies, you're looking at collections of data and collection of workflows because it's a collection of tools that you're using to do the analysis. And I think interoperability is a particularly complex and thorny issue. It's complex to do. It's doesn't immediately seem to be of much benefit. And if you have to drive to an outcome and that's where your funding's coming from, you're not going to spend time doing interoperability. So I think that cloud platforms have really proliferated here because academic funding agencies and I think commercial companies do prioritize the immediate outcomes over interconnectivity and reuse of data. And I think we have to come to a balance here. I don't think we've got there yet, because if you just do interconnectivity and reuse of data without an outcome, why are you doing it? On the other hand, if you're just doing an outcome and you're building it on use cases, those are fairly brittle, and you're only going to build a system that handles 3 or 4 of them. So this balance is where there's a lot of discussion at the moment in the community, and understanding where that sits is very important. So back to team science a little bit here. This is where a matrixed team that has different skills can understand these balances. You may be coming from a software engineering perspective, you may be coming from biology perspective, you may be coming from an outcome perspective where you don't know anything about tools. And I think having those voices heard and being able to listen to each other will drive to a balance between these two things, the outcome and the interconnectivity. So some additional things here to think about what's changing and things that are, I think, improving this. So the picture at the top of this is kind of pointing to this, which is left picture there at the top is what I described as cloud platforms that don't have fairness, and then data commonses that do. I think you're getting a blending of those two because there's an understanding that there's value to do that. It's not perfect, but I think it's starting to happen a lot more. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. So there's increasing examples of value of sharing data effectively. It's become really important. I raised this at the beginning of this talk. COVID-19. It was pretty clear fairly early on that we had an inability to know where the data was, be able to share it, and to be able to do something with it. So where were the cases? Where were they happening? What was the level of spread? Who was dying? Who was getting sick? What was comorbidities? All of that kind of pieces of information were in different silos across the country. And I think a network of people that had interdisciplinary skills really tried to look at this to try and solve that problem. And I think this is one example of a number that is showing that when you can share your data effectively, you can get to good outcomes quickly, but you need to think about that interconnectivity in order to be able to do that, or you're spending an awful lot of time data cleaning and data wrangling. I think organizations are recognizing the value of consistent and shareable data. They're realizing, with the example I gave above about COVID, that when you do that, it gives you a valuable outcome, but you have to spend a little time up front to clean your data and spend time to make it interoperable and aligned with FAIR principles. I think funding agencies are proactively supporting data sharing policies and open data tool and standards. For example, as I mentioned before, NIH's new 2023 data sharing policies are really quite deep and complex, and I really applaud them for starting to think through the implications of that. They're much more aligned with FAIR than I think any previous policies. And I think having funding agencies lead from that perspective, it's going to drive all of that work within grants and contracts that the NIH is running, but that's also going to be true across all of HHS agencies. I think also adoption and also promotion in the sense of support for, not promoting individually, open data and tool standards, I think is really important. They're asking people not to recreate the wheel and develop your own data schema or tool or data format, but to reuse what's out there already and to participate in those community-driven standards. I think cloud vendors are creating consistent services that work across clouds. Early on, the vendors were very specific to their own clouds and they did not want to have inter-cloud connectivity. You can run services now between clouds and similar services run on each cloud. That makes it a lot more consistent if you're doing that kind of work. Microservices. This is another element where I think of these as small functions, often APIs, that loosely couple together to accomplish a complex task. So they're not some monolithic system. They're little collections of services that can do something individually that you can connect together like Lego blocks. And I think there's certainly growth in this area for a number of different groups that are building commonses that are using microservices as these functions to couple together things rather than to build monolithic systems. And it allows connectivity by those APIs to other systems. I think there's further development and improved adoption of the community-driven standards and software standards and integration of those into cloud platforms. Depositing data and software in open repositories. This includes GitHub, but there are also collections of repositories. I know that NIH is looking to reuse and to deposit data that's coming out from PIs into current repositories that they already support. I think another element here that's really important is citation of data. And that is, in journal articles in the past, citation has not been present. There's been no way to do that. That's been changing over time. If you can cite your data in tools and also show where you've deposited it, and that's a requirement in papers, in journal articles, I think that will be incredibly important for the reuse of data in tools. It makes it a lot easier to find and actually to reuse if they're following FAIR principles. I think another key one is improved education of data and infrastructure issues by organizations' leaderships. Often what I found is the leadership, C-suite in commercial organizations, but leadership in government organizations, they're often not that well versed in data or IT or systems or infrastructure, or they're only versed in one. And they're asking their teams within their organization to help them understand what they need to do, but they themselves are not very well educated in that. So what you will end up getting is a lack of understanding of what really needs to get done. They'll drive it to just outcomes, and they won't think about this interconnectivity and why that's valuable. So if we improve the education of the organizational leadership, I think this will help us a great deal in overcoming some of these problems. I think the last one here is really important, and it touches on what I think Jack has been trying to drive at with this series, is the use of interdisciplinary teams. If I take it back to what I just said about organizational leadership, if you have interdisciplinary teams that work together, if the scientists understand what the computer scientists are doing, if the computer scientists understand the science, the biomedical science, if you have ethicists working with you, if you have people with different skills that come together to deliver on a project, and there's an equalness about their skills, it will help drive organizations in terms of using their data per se. Those people will lead those parts of the conversation, but those people in those interdisciplinary teams, I think, will also rise to leadership positions with organizations, and that will change the culture of organizations over time. So I think it's these collective things that we're starting to see that I think is going to change the landscape of the way that we handle ecosystems, and we drive to interconnectivity in a way that's meaningful for the community, useful, that it still gets to outcomes, and is supported and the incentives aligned, whether you work for academia or industry, to get to that outcome. Right, getting to just my last slide here. I'd like to thank a number of people here, particular Jack and his team. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and this great idea of the workshop. I'm really looking forward to going to that. I'd also like to thank Dean Phil Bourne at UVA. He and I worked at NIH together, but also we've been working at UVA. And he and I are very interested in data commons and have been speaking about this for many years. And also especially thank you to Dr. Nathan Sheffield. Nathan wrote a paper recently where some of the information I provided here is discussed. He's discussed it in way more detail. And the premise of the talk is really strongly about how microservices could be one solution to looking at fair data and analysis. And I've just included the reference here in the DOI. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jürgen Klenk, who's my co-lead for the Deloitte Biomedical Data Science team, my entire Deloitte BDS team, who I learn from every single day, and I realize what I don't know. They're a young group of incredibly enthusiastic, fun people to work with that really do espouse interdisciplinary approaches. And each day I realize my own blindness. So I thank that team a great deal for pointing out things that I need to learn. I'd also lastly like to thank many NIH colleagues who I worked with previously. I spent over a decade at NIH. And there are many people at NIH who really diligently support fair best practices. They really care about it, and they have a very strong understanding of it. And they come from very strong biomedical and also compute science backgrounds. And I'm really pleased to see that NIH is making quite big strides in this area. And it has some fantastic people that work there that can really take them to the next step. All right, I think that's my last slide, Jack. So back to you.
Thank you, Vivian. That was wonderful. And you will certainly find an ally in me about the strengths and importance of having a team science approach in this business. Biomedicine is hard enough, by yourself, just to keep up, just to be able to understand all that's going on. And so you really need to have smart people working in those domain areas where you can turn to them and have them, basically just uncover your blindness, right? So of what you need to know about. I was impressed when you were talking about organizations being born digital, and they'll be defined by their data assets. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, let me get back to that slide so I can remind myself what you were saying there, or myself.
You were saying.
Yeah, I was saying. So you're talking about this one.
I'm not seeing your slides at the moment. But
sorry.
Sure, it's the same one.
Yeah, this is a digital economy is characterized by using data to gain a business advantage. Is that which one?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
So what I mean by that is I think if organizations don't, so if I get this right, organizations that are not born digital will be at a disadvantage. What I mean by that is I think organizations need to understand that they have a lot of digital assets and they need to figure out how to leverage those in order to really be a player in the digital economy. So universities traditionally have, there's a lot of data from experiments, but it's written in a notebook. So there are now electronic notebooks, but how do you share those electronic notebooks? It's thinking about everything that you've got digitally and ensuring that it is digital, so that you can take most advantage of the data you have. That could be scientific data, but it could also be enterprise data, like student data, information about how many students attended class. You don't take roll by paper anymore, you do it digitally. I think these kinds of things give us insights of data at scale, and we need to think about that broadly across an organization. So I think it really takes that mindset of thinking digitally from the outset. That's what I mean by born digital, that you really are doing it from the outset and thinking about that, because I think that's going to give you the greatest understanding of your own data and interconnectivity.
I certainly think that as we are collecting more and more data through, advances in the various technologies that, are in laboratories now, or that, I'm just thinking of like cell sorters and various other things that are helping us to collect data ever faster, gene sequencers, MRI scanners. That data is being born digitally. It used to involve, somebody doing a lot of hard work to, get the data into a form which would probably pop out in a spreadsheet. And now it's, gigabytes and terabytes worth of information. It itself is born digitally. And so by thinking from the get-go about those as digital assets that are themselves born digital, and you are creating an organization or kind of pivoting your organization to being more digital is important. And I was thinking that this is probably important as people are entering the field, and things like the NIH Strides program are becoming something we need to attend to. And I don't know that you mentioned it specifically, but I'm curious if you might share what you know about it.
I do know about it, but that's mostly because I used to deal with it from the inside at NIH, but I also have the great fortune of working with it now as part of Deloitte. So which part of it would be most valuable to you, to tell you what it is or how something else?
Well, what it is, what its aspirations are, and what its current status might be, if you know.
Sure. So first of all, I can't represent NIH, but this is just my understanding of it. So Strides was born as a way to be able to provide NIH with access to cloud, because what had happened over time is researchers had been using primarily AWS, but some GCP, but not under the auspices of NIH. And the problem becomes particularly cost, because academic institutions and academics can't afford the commercial prices. And it doesn't make sense at scale. So if you're using part of your grant to pay for cloud and you're paying commercial costs and you're doing it multiple times, it just didn't seem like an economy of scale. And also it made sense since the world is digitally born, right? As you pointed out quite rightly, Jack, things coming off machines are born digital.
Yep.
Cloud was going to be used more and more. So NIH needed to develop some sort of relationship in an appropriate way with the cloud providers. That was the driving force behind it. And then what Strides was to set up an agreement with cloud providers. It started with GCP and AWS. I believe it's moved to Azure now, where the concept behind it is that there's a reduced price for use of compute, storage, and services. The idea behind it is that it allows researchers to get a better price on that. And it's also allowing NIH to work better with cloud providers to understand what services they do provide and how they can be better used for science. That's essentially what it does. And it's complicated to get that done within a government organization, but I think they're making great strides, no pun intended, in terms of actually leveraging that. So that's currently what I know about Strides.
What you talked a little bit about some of the work that you've done with Nathan Sheffield, who's a faculty member here at UVA, the stuff that you've done on microservices, or at least looking at them as a possible solution. Do you feel that microservices are something that's, instead of crafting one big giant all singing, all dancing solution, is that if microservices themselves were granular enough that people could kind of create their own workflows through data in a much more nimble fashion? Is that one of the ideals behind the microservices movement?
Yeah, and I urge people to go read the paper. I think he's done a really nice job of that. Yes, I think the idea behind it and what he uses in the paper is the concept of Linux, right? Or Unix, right? You can run an individual service that in itself is very minor, but coupled together with a bunch of things, you can come up with a very complex workflow. and they're all in the same system using the same kind of methodologies. And that's the idea. Also, you can mix and match. You may not need every single thing in a monolithic system, so that those microservices are a way to loosely couple things together to accomplish a complex process. It does still require you to have a computing background, but it's not requiring you to be part of a monolithic service. And I certainly know of people that only want to live the world by microservices and not monolithic cloud platforms. But I think there's probably a happy balance between those, since not all scientists can code or know how to use an API.
What does what do microservices and sort of the, cobbling together your own workflows, which is not a bad thing, but out of microservices, what does that say about data provenance and reproducibility of processing?
Well, a lot. I mean, if you have a set of services that are operating on fair data, then, and you also track the provenance, I think that's a good thing to try and do at all times, because you'll understand what you started with and where you came to an end to. So I think that's a really important aspect of the way that it would handle it. And also the consistency in the handoff between those services, if the services themselves are fair. And I think that that's really critical in terms of doing that. They could also, depending on how you set them up, not handle data provenance. They could actually end up turning this around if they're not connected well together and lead to more problems. But I think that's the nature of where we're at. I don't think microservices are the only solution or the solution. I think, as I was saying in my last slide, they're one of a collection of things that we have to try out and then think about the actual data we're feeding into them in order to understand the implications and impacts of them, including on provenance.
I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts. I completely agree about the role of team science and why that's important. Do you think that there has been a cultural shift towards this notion of team science here? And I mean, since more and more data and organizations are being born digital, we sort of need to become, more attuned to what's going on in fields that are adjacent to us, in contrast to being these like hyper specialized people, that only really focus on our own thing. Is there an increased awareness of the need for team science as we're performing the data science that's needed to understand these complex data sets?
It depends. It depends on the organizations. I've certainly seen organizations, academic and commercial, that see the value of it. They realize that bringing interdisciplinary teams together helps figure out what problem they really have and what they're going to tackle in what time frame and why. I think that's certainly true. But I've definitely seen organizations which are driven by pure science that pay no attention to the complexities of the software engineering or even project management. They're treated as plumbers. And when that happens, you tend to drive to use case driven systems. I think of those as brittle use cases, because you build a system that will handle 3 use cases and it won't do a 4th one at all. And the software engineering and the project management are aligned just with delivering that. But if it's driven from a science perspective without understanding of these other complexities of software engineering and PMO, project management, you get to these brittle use cases. I think it's also disrespectful to the team's skills. Not everyone in the team needs to have a Ph.D. or an MS. Right? It depends what your skill is. I have many people on my team that they have an undergraduate degree in whatever. They're very skilled at project management. They're certified as PMPs, and they are equally as valuable as someone who has a PhD or an MS in bioscience. So I think it depends on the organizations. I think we've got a way to go. I think commercial organizations are understanding that to drive to an outcome, I'll talk about it in pharma, when you're driving to drug outcomes, in terms of new drugs on market, you need to be able to drive large data through cloud, and you need to be able to work in interdisciplinary teams so that you can it speeds up what you're trying to do. They can really help. I think interdisciplinary teams can help speed to outcome, to get to more reasonable outcomes that are useful in a broader sense, probably drive costs down if they really work effectively together. And I think one of the most underrated skills is listening. If you've got people with different skills in your team, they're not going to be an engineer. Then they're going to need to understand, the engineer is going to have to be able to understand how to speak in a language that's translatable to the person that isn't. So we have plenty of people in my team that are explaining the science to the data scientist about why you need to use that R code or that Python, whatever, to take an outcome. This is what the science we're trying to do. So let's apply the right code. And they're sharing information all the time. It helps our data scientists who don't have coding experience understand the complexities of coding, and the coders understanding why they're actually doing what they're doing.
What sort of advice might you have for data scientists kind of learning about commons and cloud architectures who are maybe working in disciplinary teams with, say, biologists? What sort of things might they need to know as they enter into those relationships and organizations?
Listening is the most important skill. Realizing that you don't know everything, that your world is not their world, and trying to understand what it is they're trying to achieve. Respect for each one's skills. A higher degree does not mean that you have more skill over someone else. It's the multitude of skills that come together. I think the soft skills are really important in terms of team science. They're often underrated, but for a team to really work together, it's those soft skills. It's often not the hard skills. They have them. It's how you bring them together. It's the sharp edges. What do you do when you get to a disagreement or you don't understand? Those are the pieces that you need to bring together, and you need to pay attention to it. So almost you need to leave your coding skills at the door and start being a human with another human trying to figure out how it works. And once you do that, then you can bring the skills to the table, often not the other way around.
Isn't it interesting that after all of this technology, all of this advanced computing, sophisticated computing languages, and dealing with terabytes and terabytes of data, it comes down to a human-human interaction that is really the end result of all of this. It's kind of interesting coming for, in a full circle like that.
I agree. I think it's the human interactions, because, I mean, we ask computers to do things. We make data fair because we want to learn something from it. But it's really us as humans getting together to understand. And those are just tools, whether it's a data commons, data fairness, software, you name it. Those are tools to help us understand what we're trying to do. But it really comes down to communication between us in terms of understanding what are we trying to get done here with the set of tools that we need to accomplish that. It's a really tough one. I often think about this and think you can say what you want to code. It's not going to fight back unless you change some line of code. But if you don't have a pleasant conversation with another human being, it can result in not a pleasant outcome. And your project can tank maybe because of bad relationships. It's very important, I think, to have those soft skills so that you can find the ways to work with people that aren't in your field and then bring the tools to the table, not the other way around.
Vivian, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and providing us with a lot of insights into the role of team science, into all this complex cloud infrastructure that we're certainly, if you're not familiar with it, you soon will be. But it's really important at the end of the day, it's people who are interested in this. We're always interested in machine learning. I think people learning still has a role in all of this. I want to conclude our Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series for this particular theme on the secondary health effects of COVID-19. I want to thank Gina Kamdar and Hannah Kierce for being my helpers to make all of this work so smoothly. They're the ones responsible for organizing all of these speakers and for promoting things on social media. And so none of this would be possible without them. We are really looking forward to meeting with all of our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants in person in Seattle, Washington, here in a little more than a month. I think having Vivian there is going to be very exciting. We have other NIH program officials who are going to be joining us, as well as a slate of really engaged and enthusiastic mentors. So we're really looking forward to that. And I just want to thank everybody who's joined us over the last several months to thank you so much for doing so. I hope you've learned something, and we will look forward to seeing you all again in the fall when we start up with whatever our next theme is going to be. We haven't yet decided yet, but we will. But in the meantime, everyone have a wonderful Cinco de Mayo for those of you who observe, and have a wonderful Friday and a great weekend. And